Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to talk about contemporary music reviews of the Beatles in the 60s and 70s. Just before I do that, just want to cover the news that there's going to be, inverted commas, a new Beatles song, which we think is going to be Now and Then, using where Paul McCartney has announced they've used artificial intelligence to improve the quality of Lennon's voice. And people have asked me what's my reaction. To be honest, I'm not excited about it. I'm willing to be proved wrong and willing to listen to it when it comes out. But from what I've heard, it's not a very strong song. I know George Harrison didn't like it and vetoed it at the time of the anthology. It's just a bit wishy-washy for me, but maybe they're going to do a superb job on it. I'm not sure if George and Ringo are involved at all. I don't think they had time to lay down a proper track of it at the time in '95. I know there's a track on YouTube which purports to be the Beatles, the three Beatles doing it, but I don't think it is. And I don't buy this thing about there was a tape which John made and he wrote for Paul on the tape. I mean, that never came out at the time of the anthology, so why is it coming out now? I just don't buy it. At the very most, I think Yoko might have written on the cover of some cassette for Paul just to make sure she remembered to give it to him, because she did give him a cassette of demos in around '94. Anyway, so I'm not particularly excited. Maybe you are. We'll see. The jury is out as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, just wanted to cover some contemporary reviews of the Beatles using the material I have, and sorry if this review is another Beatles-centric one. It's just that I have more material related to this topic than any other, so I'm probably more qualified to talk about it. And it's quite interesting to see that at the time in the 60s, the Beatles weren't always praised to the heavens. And I've even found a few very surprising cases where the opposite was the case. So let's start off with Derek Johnson in the New Musical Express reviewing Beatles for Sale. He's doing a track-by-track appraisal, and he comes to rock and roll music. And he said it showcases Paul in his more varied mood. So he even got the lead singer wrong. Now, I know when I was a 14-year-old, I used to struggle trying to work out who sung lead vocal on Beatles records, but within a year or two, that had all completely disappeared. And this guy is a seasoned journalist, from what I can understand, and he got it wrong. And Alan Evans, reviewing Sgt. Pepper, got it wrong with She's Leaving Home, saying John starts by singing about it being 5 a.m. and the girl is tiptoeing out of the house. Well, obviously it was Paul singing that line. So Alan Smith, NME White Album review, coming to the track While My Guitar. Paul again, comma, warm voice. Oh dear. Good Night, the last track on White Album. Your actual warm-voiced Paul again, singing Good Night, Sleep Tight. How Alan Smith could not recognise Ringo on Good Night and George on While My Guitar is beyond me. For being a professional rock journalist, I think that's pretty disgraceful. Alan Smith, in his famous review of the NME of Let It Be in the NME in 1970, complained bitterly about the £3 price tag, although it did come with a nice colour booklet, so I'm not sure what he was complaining about too much. If this is their last album, it will stand as a cheap epitaph, a cardboard tombstone, a sad and tatty end to a musical fusion which wiped clean and drew again the face of pop music. And he says, they're insulting the intelligence of today's record buyers by charging £3. In America, you couldn't even get the box set version. You had to get the normal version, so maybe American fans didn't have the chance to be pissed off, or they missed the opportunity to get a collector's item, depending on which way you look at it. Bill Harry has written this book called Beatlemania, where he sort of goes through the Beatles' filmography, and it's quite good because he quotes various people from contemporary reviews at the time. For example, the Daily Worker reviewing Help said, "Saved me from the unhinged, unbridled lunacy that has no roots, no meaning, no sequence, no consequence, no let-up, no pause. Saved me, notwithstanding some occasional peaks of inspired nonsense, from this ruthless elegance, this unrelenting Sunday colour supplement assault upon the senses." So the Daily Worker, not very impressed. And then Nina Hibbin of the Morning Star. And the Morning Star, I'm not sure if it still exists, but used to be pretty much a communist newspaper in the UK, but it can't have been that communist because they were reviewing the Beatles. because of course, in the Russian version of Communist, the Beatles were banned at this time. But anyway, Nina Hibbin, talking of the Let It Be film, wrote, "For those who expected it to throw some light on the development of the Beatles phenomenon, it is disappointingly barren. Paul McCartney, now very much the guiding spirit of the team, comes over as a thoroughgoing professional who, one can imagine, may switch off his Beatles self out of studio hours and change into quite a different person at home. George Harrison, with his strong-boned face and shut-in expression, looks as he could fit into any tough and isolated position, as a shepherd in Bulgaria or the manager of a suburban sub-post office. John Lennon and Ringo Starr appear to be the true individuals as far as the film allows us to glimpse their individuality, with Beatle eccentricity running through their veins." So that's quite an interesting review of Let It Be, something different. We've covered Bill Harry. Now we're going to go to the quote from Bob Gerson's reviewing the Ringo album, where he said, "It's the most successful by an ex-Beatle. It is not polemical and abrasive like Lennon's, harsh and self-pitying like Harrison's, or precious and flimsy like McCartney, but balanced, airy and amiable." No, I agree that Ringo's record is balanced, airy and amiable, but I think it's a bit lazy. It's lazy journalism to dismiss Lennon's solo work up to this point as polemical and abrasive. Polemical meaning expressing a strong opinion, critical opinion about something or someone. I mean, you could say that about How Do You Sleep and the track God, but what about all the love songs he wrote and the self-betterment stuff on Plastic Ono Band? Just lazy. And then to call Harrison stuff harsh and self-pitying, well, what about all the beautiful stuff on All Things Must Pass? I mean, really. And then, McCartney's precious and flimsy. Well, I think people have reappraised Ram and said it's one of the best solo albums of all. So anyway, just thought I'd mention that. Harry Doherty, reviewing London Town, thought that Girlfriend was sung by Linda. Pretty bad mistake. Nick Kent, just want to show you some of the reviews from 1979, just to remind you that in England in particular, the Beatles were not flavour of the month at all. And I was at school at the time, and I felt this very keenly. And Nick Kent is reviewing Wonderful Christmas Time in December 79. "No point in mincing pies about this one. Paul McCartney dons Santa Claus drag, pulls out his pocket calculator and knocks off a grotesquely twee piece of festive nose scrapings, utilising a tune of his own creation so twee and so banal that it makes Mull of Kintyre sound like John Coltrane's Namer by comparison. God knows McCartney has hit some musical troughs in his time, but this hideous offering shuts down even Mary Had a Little Lamb as our Macca's worst recording to date." That's pretty scathing, isn't it? And then George Harrison does not escape criticism. His wonderful blow-away single is dismissed by Simon Frith, another famous rock journalist. George has removed himself from the material world so successfully that his records reach us from a strange time warp, as if nothing had happened since 1967. This is instantly recognisable and instantly icky. Sample lyric from the B-side, "You're a soft touch baby, like a snowflake falling." So, Back to the Egg got slammed, and I just want to read you Danny Baker's review of McCartney 2. I think it's the same Danny Baker who became a Radio 1 DJ, I'm not sure, but it's quite an amusing review, even though I don't agree with it. But I would say it's quite a nice counterpoint to the fact that McCartney 2 these days tends to get a bit estimated, whereas this review is the complete opposite, and the truth being somewhere in the middle, of course. But this is what Danny Baker had to say. "This is a low trip. You'd think Paul McCartney had far more than enough money to resort to cheap cons like this. McCartney 2 is Paul's homebrew bitter kit that he literally knocked together at home with the minimum of technology and thought. It sounds like the most desperate of artists' memorial rip-offs, one of those that a company slings out after all the compilations but just before the dialogue album. Only the single coming up resembles anything like effort. But even that suffers because of the skinflint production job. Elsewhere, it's hard to know where to begin. There are soapy, dope ramblings like Waterfalls and Summer Days Song, which take an age to finish and come across like Fool on the Hill with a dozen anchors around its neck. Then there are a couple of instrumentals that only the most shameless of creeps would make public, all childlike and gooey simple. Which brings us to the true horror show, Bogey Music. I mean, you get the point. I won't go on. But, you know, interesting period piece. Julie Burchill reviewing Starting Over when it first came out. It was the Lennon's comeback single, of course. Didn't do anything for her. She quotes a line from the song, "Let's take a trip and fly away together all alone." To the funny farm for a nice rest, presumably. So much for McCartney writing the slop and Lennon writing the shocking rockers. An early 70s Opportunity Knox protege, one Jerry Monroe, used to do songs very similar to this. Pubs, Gracie Fields, Magdalene sing-alongs. John Lennon either needs to be put away, if this record is meant to be good, or wants to be written off, if the direness of this dirge is intentional. My guess is that he's happy in his house husband niche and did this merely to dissuade people who ask him whether he's going to get back into the studio and lay down a few new tracks. Very cynical review from Julie Burchill there. And then Ian Pye reviewing Double Fantasy. He does have a good word to say about Watching the Wheels and I'm Losing You, but he even doesn't like Woman because he says tributes to Yoko by this stage of the album are wearing thin. And he concludes the review by saying, as an old companion of John Lennon once said, some people want to fill the world with silly love songs. The trouble is they just don't know when to stop. So if you remember, well, I remember at the time, that 3-week period between when the album came out and when he was murdered, I do remember the negative reaction to Double Fantasy. It was disappointing in the UK in particular. I think the US were slightly more generous. And then Charles Shaar Murray does a beautiful tribute to John on the Tuesday morning after he was shot. And he's glowing in his admiration for him and his sadness. And then he says, whether John Lennon was making records or not, whether I was personally delighted by those records or not, I was still glad that he was around. The rest can wait. That last moment before the guy pulled the trigger, I hope you were thinking about something or someone that made you happy. I hope you were happy. I hope that somehow you still are. Hello, goodbye. Very moving from Charles Shaar Murray. So that was some what I thought were interesting examples of contemporary criticism or not. I didn't mention the Rolling Stone review of Sgt. Pepper. Forget the name of the journalist, but he basically panned the album in 1967 and said the Beatles had given us an album of sound effects. Dazzling, but ultimately fraudulent, I think was his quote. Although he did praise A Day in the Life and spent half the review discussing the merits of that track, but the rest of the album did nothing for him, which I find quite interesting. Anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.